May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O God, my rock and my redeemer. Romans 13, 1 through 5 reads like this: Let every person submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist are put in place by God. So whoever opposes the authority has resisted God's direction, and those who have resisted will bring judgment on themselves. For leaders cause no fear for good behavior, but for bad. Now, if you do not want to fear the authority, do what is good, and you will get his approval. For he is God's servant to you for your good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not carry the sword for no reason. For if he is God's servant, an avenger who inflicts punishment on the evildoer. Therefore, it is necessary to be in submission, not only because of punishment, but also because of conscience. This is a passage of scripture that I've struggled with for a long time. To govern means to rule over by right of authority. To govern a nation, to exercise a directing or restraining influence. Governing authorities are the people who are governing, enforcing the laws, setting policies, etc. Moses established governing authority over Israel in Exodus 18, chapter 25 through verse 25 through 26. He said, he chose capable men from all Israel and made them leaders of the people, officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. They served as judges for the people at all times. The difficult cases they brought to Moses, but the simple ones they decided themselves. We can have good and evil governing authorities. God acknowledged that bad governing authorities or evil governing authorities existed. It's all over in Scripture. In Hosea chapter 8, verses 3 to 4, it reads like this: But Israel has rejected what is God, what is good. An enemy will pursue him. They set up kings without my consent. They choose princes without my approval. With their silver and gold, they make idols for themselves to their own destruction. Paul, did he write about an evil governing authority or a good governing authority? It does not explicitly say. However, based on verse 4 in Romans chapter 13, which reads, For he is God's servant to you for your good, but if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not carry the sword for no reason, for he is God's servant, an avenger who inflicts punishment on the evildoer. He must have been writing about a good governing authority. Otherwise, he would not have said, if you do evil, be afraid. Because if you're doing evil in an evil governing authority, there's nothing to be afraid of. But if you're doing evil in a good governing authority, there's something to be afraid of. What if the governing authority sometimes govern with good principles and other times govern with evil principles? How do we submit? The meaning of submit, to allow myself to be subjected to an authority, whether good or bad. But good or bad, from whose perspective? What is good for one person, what is good for one government authority, may be bad for another, and vice versa. The person in authority may think of his or her good ways as pure and true. Proverbs 16 says, all a man's ways are pure in his own eyes, but God weighs the motives. From a world perspective, submit may imply weakness and feeble-mindedness. Imagine then the strength and courage it takes to buck the world's perspective and submit as God commanded us. Scripture says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Submission, then, is not weakness. Being weak and feeble is the way a person is. It is like being lazy. It is one's disposition or frame of mind. It is a condition of one's being. Submission is a free will, reasoned choice. Submit is not slavery. It is not allowing oneself to be dominated. We are not submitting to a government authority who has absolute power over us that leaves us powerless to do anything. powerless to appeal to anyone, powerless to appeal to God, powerless to appeal to other branches of government. The evil government authority of Egypt enslaved the Israelites, and the slaves appealed to God. God heard their moaning and groaning. God selected Moses to go to Pharaoh, the head of the government, to appeal to him. And we know the rest of the story. The government of Babylon was an evil government. Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego defied the government they were working in. The story is in Daniel chapter 3. Those guys were not blindly loyal to the government. The consequence for their disobedience was to be thrown in a furnace, which they survived. So is submission loyalty blind loyalty? For me, no. Blind loyalty does not imply free will. Submission is a free will choice in every moment. Loyalty is faithful adherence to whomever or whatever. For me, faithful adherence is restricted to God, the sovereign ruler. Faithful adherence is not for fallible man-made systems that may not be operating in congruence with God's will. With free will, we can choose to submit or not submit. There may be consequences associated with that choice, but we do have a choice. We have a choice to obey God's rules or to obey man's rules. Peter said in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, we must obey God rather than human beings. We have a choice to submit to God, who is the highest authority, or submit to a lower authority. We obey a lower authority when that authority is in synchronous with submitting to the will and laws of God. We obey a lower authority when it is the will of God. Thank you for listening.